In this session we're looking at the books Leviticus and Numbers. They're both supplements to the book of Exodus. Leviticus majoring on recording many more commandments, and Numbers focusing on numbering how many of the Israelites there were, not least how many of them were fit for military service. In both books there are long sections which might sorely test your conviction that sitting and reading the Bible is an enriching experience. Some of them are really difficult to read without the relevant background knowledge and an interest in the background knowledge. So what we're going to do, we're lumping the two books together, and we're going to pick out some extracts of bits that are more obviously immediately helpful to us. The three samples we're taking on the first on the subject of holiness, then on the Aaronic blessing, and then on the grumbling in the desert. Firstly then, the subject of holiness, which we will pursue in Leviticus chapter 19. The idea of holiness is an important strand in the Old Testament, not least in Leviticus. Leviticus is a book of laws. Probably the best assumption to make is that Moses began the collection of laws and that it was continued over several generations afterwards by Levitical priests, hence the name of the book. The priests were responsible not just for worship, but also for telling the people how to toe the religious line in their everyday lives. This section of Leviticus then concentrates especially on the idea of holiness. If you'd like to read for the moment just the first two verses of Leviticus 19. God is holy, and therefore you should be holy. But what does holy mean? Probably the simplest definition is set apart for God's purposes. So to say that God is holy means that God is 100% committed to his own plan and purpose, 100% committed in particular to the covenant that he's made with his people. Note that it's saying something important about God. He's not, for instance, just messing about at being God. He's doing it properly and he's consistent in the way that he does it. You then, it says, must be holy. You were made in the image of God, so you should be like God in this particular respect, committed to him and committed to doing his will. But there are some important spin-offs from this idea of holy. I've got two of them I want to share with you. The first of them is that a particular place can be holy. The tabernacle and later the temple exists entirely to bring people into contact with God. So it's entirely given over to godly things. It is of its nature a holy place. But then so was the ground in front of the burning bush, as we found in our last session. That is, a holy place doesn't have to be a religious building. Such a building does deserve respect as a holy place, but anywhere that you meet with the Lord can also be recognized as holy. The second spin-off from the idea of holy is that being holy demands a holy lifestyle, holy behaviour. The challenge is to make your way of life and take it and make sure that it fits your calling as those who are holy to the Lord. Another note before we read on in this chapter. In Latin, the word holy is sanctus, from which we get the word sanctify and the word saint. The New Testament calls you the saints in some English translations, that is, the holy people. And on various occasions through the Old Testament, the people are sanctified, that is, they receive prayer and ministry to establish them in their holy calling, usually prior to some particularly challenging event. So pointing out those connections just illustrates the fact that this idea of holy appears in places where in an English translation it doesn't actually say holy. It might say sanctify, or it might say saint. Let's read the next bit, verses 3 to 10, please. Verse 3. This verse echoes 2 of the 10 Commandments. You can't be holy unless you show that in the way you treat your parents. You can't be holy unless you set aside proper time as the Lord's time. And verse 4, this parallels the first commandment. Those who make idols in order to worship them are pretty pathetic. I mean, there are some lovely passages in the book of Isaiah which poke fun at them. But in today's context, it's stronger than that. If you say you're holy to the Lord, but make and worship an idol, you don't make sense. You don't have integrity. To worship an idol is to insult the Lord, to make it clear that you think that the Lord can't meet your needs, so that you have to run to some other source for help. Verses 5 to 8, there were specific regulations for the performance of a fellowship offering. What fellowship offerings were needn't concern us here. It's an area of detailed Old Testament study which we can happily manage without just at the moment. What concerns us here is that when you worship, don't do it half-heartedly. Don't just go through the motions thinking that you've done. And this touches especially on the issue of holiness, because their idea was that the food in a fellowship offering was holy and therefore ought to be eaten on the holy occasion of the offering itself. To keep the food aside and use it to save you cooking another day would, in their eyes, profane the holy food. Now, I find I can't relate to that as a regulation to carry over into our own lives. But it comes somewhere close to it when in the way that some people treat the bread at the end of a communion service. I'm perfectly happy myself that leftovers should be put out for the birds after the service. But I even like that Greek Orthodox practice of setting aside in the service not only the bread that's needed for the communion itself, but also a whole load of bread rolls which will be dished out to the children after the service, so that the kids have their share even in a way in the holiest part of the worship. But against that, you should be aware of Roman Catholic practice, where the normal practice is to keep the leftovers after the Mass. They're kept in a little tent, either by the altar or on the altar, little tent called the tabernacle, and a small red light stays alight to signal their presence. Catholics will bow or genuflect to the reserved sacrament, as they call it, or even as they go down the street past the church, they'll cross themselves because it's the place where the reserved sacrament is kept. And to many Catholics, a church like the one that I go to is an empty church because it doesn't contain that symbol of the presence of Jesus. Verses 9 and 10. In Old Testament society, most people didn't have jobs, working, that is, for someone else for payment. All the more so, women didn't have jobs. So anyone who wasn't a part of a family business was without any obvious means of support. And that included, most obviously, widows and foreigners. A principal source of food for such people was gleaning, following the harvesters round a field or vineyard and picking up the scraps they left. These verses say that someone living a holy life will be like God in having a soft spot for the poor and will make sure that there are gleanings left to be gleaned. Today's equivalent, I don't have a field or a vineyard, but I think we should make an effort not to resent our taxes that we have to pay, because in part they fund our welfare state. There are times, quite often, where we voluntarily share our income and or our time through some sort of charity work. These are ways of providing for the poor in a way that has the same attitude as making sure to leave some gleanings in your field. Would you read now, please, verses 11 to 19? Selection of comments here, some with a commentary showing what behaviour is unacceptable because it violates holiness. Perhaps the bit we should especially pick up on is verse 18, the second half of the verse which Jesus quoted as the second most important commandment in the Old Testament. Whatever the Lord meant in issuing this commandment, the Old Testament people did tend to take it to mean that your neighbour was your fellow Jew, and they were the people that you should express your love to. That's the view which Jesus blew apart in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Would you read now, please, 20 to 22? These verses show how far we've travelled since then. For a start, that slaves existed, and that having sex with a slave was a lesser offence than lying with a free woman. The stuff about bringing a ram to the priest can have its equivalent for us. I mean, when you've got it wrong, you must seek the Lord's forgiveness. Rams and priests probably don't come into it for us. Jesus has made all those things old hat. But the issue of seeking forgiveness is still there. And you may need someone to help you do that and believe that the Lord has accepted your confession and given you forgiveness. Now if you'd read please 23 to 25. I can't see any sense in this other than that it's good husbandry of the tree. Possibly dressing this up as a holiness demand is the best way in that particular society of getting it heeded. They certainly didn't have anything like a scientific approach to such things, which would give them the sort of reasons for good husbandry that we might more readily accept. But there is more. If you're holy to the Lord, then you should be practicing good and wise husbandry of the resources at your disposal. Recycling, economical use of water and fuels, reducing your carbon footprint, finding a sensible and responsible balance between work and leisure, between work and family, or indeed between work and family and church. These are issues which you ought to take seriously and make a decent job of. Would you read please 26 to 31? In 26 we find the basis of kosher food laws. The sense behind this was lost many centuries ago, so it just sort of sits there without making any sense to us. Or I think that verse 27 just requires a question mark and an exclamation mark to it. I'm not going to try and say anything sensible about that. But verse 28, expressing mourning by slashing your skin with knives may be done by pagans. I mean, in the area covered by these documents, originally they would have been sort of hot-headed Middle Easterners after all. But, says this regulation, it is not for you. But what about tattoos? I'm afraid I'm old-fashioned on this one. I rather agree. I mean, there is a big association between tattoos and the occult, but I'm not inclined to make a fuss about it. Verse 31. You are holy, dedicated to the Lord. Make no mistake about it. People into occult practices are serving the other department, so associating with them would be a direct contradiction of your loyalty to the Lord. So, in simple, don't do it. Would you finish reading the chapter now, please, 32 to the end of the chapter? Verse 32, as someone who qualifies as the aged, I think people showing respect for the elderly, and I think it's a good idea. 33 and 34. Hospitality to strangers is not only a mark of civilization, it is a mark, it says, of holiness. 35 and 36. I often feel that the quickest way to destroy civilized life is not to tell the truth, and it's presented here as a fast track also to destroying holiness. And the second half of verse 36, a frequent encouragement in the Old Testament, remember where you've been and how you've needed other people to treat you. Let that be an input in how you decide to treat others. And in verse 37, a summary. To be holy, to be dedicated to doing the Lord's will, means finding out what the Lord's will is and then straightforwardly setting out to do it. And that completes our first sample in this section. Our second sample from these books is from Numbers chapter 6, and it is the creation of the Aaronic blessing, the blessing that Aaron was to use. We need to look at one detail first of the way that the 12 tribes were organized. One of the tribes, the tribe of Levi, was dedicated to the tabernacle and later temple duties, and they were forbidden to own land, so their only means of support was the tithes that the other tribes paid. I suppose 11 tribes tithing was presumably enough for the running of the sanctuary and for suitable stipends for the Levites. Within the tribe of Levi, one particular family had special duties. The descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. They had the job of serving as priests, while the rest of the Levites performed supporting duties. In later years, when a reform of the priesthood was needed, the priestly duties were further limited to the descendants of Zadok. Mr. Handel frequently reminds us that Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. We need to have a reminder of what a priest is. In principle, a priest is someone who has an access to God which ordinary people don't have, and who uses that access to put other people in touch with God. He's an intermediary between God and people. Many priestly duties centre around presiding at worship, especially sacrificial worship, the idea being that the only person who's properly authorised can perform such holy duties. But then there are other priestly acts to do, like blessing people. Well, before we explore that, we better stop and reflect briefly on our position vis-à-vis priests. The sort of church that I go to, our understanding of the New Testament is that every Christian has the same full access to God, so there can't be a special group of people within the church who have an access to God that other Christians don't have and can't have. That is, we cannot have an order of priests. We cannot have such people on a sort of higher plane than the rest. There are, of course, some churches, notably Orthodox Catholic and Anglican, whose grasp of the New Testament would appear to be less strong than their respect for tradition. And they work on the idea that religions have priests, and therefore they ought to. Also, they treat the communion service as a sacrifice, offering again the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And if you've got a sacrifice, you've got to have priests doing it. Although these churches together contain a large majority of the world's Christians, we do venture the belief that they haven't got this bit right. Well, let's read the Numbers passage in Numbers chapter 6 from verse 22 to the end of the chapter. Verse 23. Aaronic priests, then, are to bless the people. To bless someone is to secure the connection between them and God, to establish them afresh in their relationship with God and in their determination to do his will, so that what they do for God deserves and gets God's cooperation. That's a lot to achieve when you bless someone. What this passage calls for is an act of prayer designed to produce this result. In reality, of course, achieving such a blessing may involve quite a bit more than a quick prayer. It could involve counselling. It could involve praising, rebuking, correcting, teaching, walking beside someone, all other sorts of ministry to them. But even so, let's not underestimate the value of the act of prayer. Verse 24. If you are to be blessed, then that requires a sovereign, gracious act of God. I want to reflect on those two words, sovereign first of all. It's his business to bless or to withhold his blessing. So what we can do is to call on him to bless. If you're convinced that it is God's intention to bless a particular person, then you can be particularly bold in your prayer for God to bless. You can almost declare that the Lord will bless them. And very often the Lord bless you is then a sort of cross between a prayer and a confident declaration that the Lord will bless someone. So that's the importance of the idea of God's sovereignty here. The other word was that he is gracious. If the Lord is to give his blessing to the likes of us, then his love for us must overcome his distaste at what is often our behaviour. The Bible encourages us to believe that the Lord is only too ready to overcome his distaste, and the word grace is often attached to that attitude and to God's actions in that respect. Grace, what does it say in the dictionary? The unmerited favour of God. We do not deserve his blessing. We cannot do anything to make ourselves deserve it. So if the Lord blesses us, it's a matter of grace, not of his rewarding us for what we've done or for our being the great people that we are. In verse 24, it speaks about the Lord blessing you and the Lord keep you. This smacks to me of the father-child relationship we have with God. He keeps us in the sense of looking after us and watching out for us. That's quick and easy to say, but it's a massive claim. Again, big chunks of grace. In verse 25, it speaks about the Lord's face shining on you. The Bible is clear that we can't look at God and survive. So what's envisaged here cannot be literally a direct experience of seeing his face. This therefore has to be taken to be picture language for the Lord letting us know that he is in relationship to us and that that relationship is alive and active at this moment. But there's more. If his face is to shine on you, that surely means that in one way or another he's taking a delight in you. There's that passage in Zephaniah 3 verse 17. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. Lovely picture of the Lord leading the party singing in heaven because of the delight he takes in you. Or in the image of a returning sinner in the parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. So that's they're pictures of the Lord's face shining in your direction. And be gracious to you, it says in verse 25, where we've already reflected on how the Lord needs to act in grace in order to bless people like us. Verse 27, it's got his face again. It's a stronger verse in a sense than 25. There are times where we feel that the Lord has turned his back on us. Sometimes it's just because it feels that way because we've let our spiritual health deteriorate so much, or there's some other reason why we're down in the dumps. But sometimes it can be absolutely right that in his fatherly discipline the Lord is leaving us to sort out some problem in our own lives. And here the prayer for blessing is calling on the Lord to put an end to such a period and positively turn towards us and give you peace. The Hebrew word shalom, which is the word for peace in this section, is a powerful word. I mean, even in the New Testament, where although it's written in Greek, the word for peace there, eirene, is used with such a Semitic accent that we should understand it there to be the Hebrew idea of shalom. So what does that word mean? The basic meaning of shalom is wholeness. Everything is in the right place in your life, and you should be able to sense the goodness and the rightness of it. So to experience shalom, you need to be in a good working relationship with the Lord. You need not to be putting up too much resistance to what he's bringing into your life. This idea of peace is very similar to what you find in John 14 and verse 27. Peace I leave you with you, my peace I give you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. The peace which the Lord gives is not the worldly kind. It's not primarily a cessation of conflict. It's not primarily a feeling of being calm and otherwise okay. It is a substantial putting right of the bits of your life so that you can sense the rightness and the goodness of it. It can even be that the world around you is in serious conflict, but you know the Lord's peace in the midst of it. In verse 27 speaks of the Lord putting his name on the people. The prayer of blessing has repeatedly used the term the Lord, or in the Hebrew, Yahweh. It's not some vague seeking after a warm spiritual glow. It's a very specific prayer that this named God will bless you. In that sense, it's marking the people with the name of their God. And then he gives the assurance, and I will bless them. The Lord declares that it's his intention to bless the Israelites. He'd promised as much to Abraham. In fact, he'd promised more than that, namely that Abraham's descendants would also be the means of his blessing to the rest of the world, and not just to his chosen people. There are a couple of consequences of this, as far as we're concerned, I mean. The first is that as the heirs of the promise to Abraham through Jesus, we should know that it's the Lord's intention to bless us. This isn't something confined merely to the people of the Old Testament. And the second is that, delightful though it may be to realize that we're under the Lord's blessing, we should realize further that it also frees us up to set about being a blessing to the rest of the world. That may be a description of our serving other people, or even our leading them to know the Lord. All sorts of ministries to other people can serve as a blessing to them. So, Aaron's blessing. I think it's a powerful and lovely prayer. Whenever I've baptized anyone, I've always used this to conclude the baptism. How could you find a better way to pronounce the Lord's blessing on someone who's just signed up? Well, anyway, that concludes our second sample from these books today. Our third sample is taken from Numbers 14 on the subject of the grumbling. Moses was leading the Israelites across the desert which lay between Egypt and Canaan. And when they nearly reached their destination, the Lord then prompted him to send a recce party into the land so that they could plan their conquest. So 12 men were selected, one from each tribe, and they took 40 days to explore the land. The Lord had promised Moses to lead them up into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and when the spies returned, they confirmed that it was indeed just such a place. But the rest of the recce report was divided. The majority report from 10 of the 12 spies was that the people living in the land seemed well established, so that an invasion by a motley crowd of runaway slaves would seem foolish. They even exaggerated the apparent size and strength of the population. So they advised, do not try an invasion. The minority report from Caleb and Joshua was along these lines. God has promised us the land. He's promised us victory over the current inhabitants. However strong they seem to us, they are weak because they've got on the wrong side of the Lord. So what are we waiting for? The majority even organised a rally for the people to spread their reading of the situation. Well, we're going to take up the story, as I say, in Numbers 14, if you'd like to read the first 4 verses. Verse 1. The 10 spies had done an efficient job in spreading their cowardly and faithless attitude, and there was a general panic. Verse 2. The people then directed their grumbling to Moses and Aaron. Just stop and think about this before we read on. Under Moses, the people had experienced the Lord's power in reducing the Egyptians to the state where they had to let the Israelites go. They'd known his power also in leading them across the sea into Arabia. They'd known his protection in the desert by day and by night. They'd known his provision of food in the desert. And now these same people turned on Moses and complained that he disturbed their security in Egypt and brought them on a dangerous mission in which they were bound to perish. Just how much more was the Lord supposed to do for them before they would at least be grateful and preferably even be excited about what he was still to do with them? But grumble they did. They even drew the conclusion that it would be better to die in the desert than to risk all by invading Canaan. And verse 4, the obvious thing for them was regime change. Choose a leader other than Moses or Aaron to coordinate a return to Egypt. If you'd read now, please, verses 5 to 9. Verse 5. Moses and Aaron humiliated themselves by pleading with the people to abandon that line of action. And 6 to 9. Caleb and Joshua, the 2 good spies, tore their clothes as a sign of their grief at what the people were doing. And they argued with the assembly, trying to persuade them to trust the Lord's promise and invade the land. If you'll only trust the Lord, you'll find that the inhabitants' strength will count for nothing. It's we who have the Lord's protection. It's we to whom the Lord has promised the victory. So let's go for it. You read now, please, 10 to 25. Verse 10. Despite all their pleading, these 2 men had so little success with their rousing speeches that there was widespread talk of stoning the 2 of them so that the majority could have their way. And then the story takes a major turn. The Lord appears and talks with Moses. Although it was Moses he was talking to, it seems that his glory was visible to the others, so that they knew something was going on, even though they couldn't actually eavesdrop on the conversation itself. It's not by any means clear in the text what this glory bit means, but it could mean that there appeared the cloud, the Shekinah, which was from time to time taken to be a sign of God's presence and his glory. Verses 11 and 12. The Lord obviously has a very justified moan to Moses and declares that he'll slaughter the lot of them and start again with Moses and his family. What follows reminds me of the haggling you would expect of a Jewish market trader trying to get the best price on a sale. And I think it's very endearing and quite funny. Verses 13 to 16. Moses puts the well-argued point that if God were to wipe them all out, it wouldn't do the Lord's reputation any good. The Egyptians, for instance, had been sold the line that it was the Israelites' great God who had rescued them from their slavery. Well, they could well conclude that this God wasn't actually up to the job of getting his people into their promised land. And of course it won't just be the Egyptians. I mean, other nearby nations are aware of what's been happening and could well come to the same conclusion. Not good publicity. Verse 17. Surely, Moses argues, it's better for you, Lord, for there to be an unambiguous display of your strength, not something which could be taken as a sign of weakness. Verse 18. Moses then quotes a pair of sayings about the Lord, one that he's ready to forgive his people, and 2, that his just punishment can stretch to allowing the consequences of people's wrongdoing to be felt even by their children, even their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Verse 19. So he puts in the final plea. Let it be your propensity to forgive sins which dominates now. You've pardoned your people before, so show your generosity of spirit by pardoning them again now. Verse 20, "Okay, says the Lord, it's as good as done. I've already forgiven them as you asked. You were perfectly right." But, verse 21, there's unfortunately rather more to it than that. Verse 22, "I cannot allow these people who have grumbled against me to enter into the land." Verse 23, "It wouldn't be right for those who have treated me with contempt to enter the promised land." Verse 24, "I'll make an exception, of course, for Caleb and his family." Strangely, Joshua isn't mentioned here, although he is included with Caleb in verse 30, where the subject resumes. "So, says the Lord, I can't let you lead these people into the land. You must turn around, head back towards Egypt, not to enter Egypt again, but to live the lives of nomads in this desert until all the grumblers have died out. And then their children can inherit the promise along with Caleb and Joshua." If you read now, please, 26 to 35. It's this judgment from God that, of course, is why a journey which should have taken even such a large crowd just a few weeks actually took them 40 years. Now, verses 36 to 45. 36 and 37. Almost, as it were, to get the dying out process started, the Lord accelerated the death of the 10 bad spies. They'd been on a collision course with the Lord anyway, so that's no great surprise. Verse 39, "When Moses reported to the people what the Lord had said, the 10 bad spies had already been struck down, so it didn't take too much brain power for the people to conclude that they were in trouble. But they didn't absorb the judgment which the Lord had issued. Instead, they tried to solve things their own way. They said they would make a decent show of repentance, and then they would, after all, follow the advice of Caleb and Joshua and invade the land. But, says Moses in verse 41, you can't do that. The 10 spies were quite right in thinking that you couldn't manage the invasion in your own strength. And if you invade now, your strength will be all you have, because the Lord will not be with you. He's said you must turn back." 44 and 45. Despite Moses' plea, some of them did mount an invasion attempt, and they were completely routed by the existing locals. Well, it did happen, as the Lord had declared, that over the next 40 years all those who were adults at the time of the grumbling died out, apart from Joshua and Caleb and their families. Then Joshua was appointed Moses' successor and led the grumblers' children into the land. It's a dreadful thing to be on the receiving end of God's grace and then let it count for nothing in the way that you lead your lives. It's absolutely essential that the way you live is at least consistent with the grace bestowed on you in Jesus, and you're likely to find that at some time the Lord will impose a specific shape on your life which you would be well to follow. That then concludes our explorations into Leviticus and Numbers.